Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Tapey. I'm the director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies, and I want to welcome you to the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies online program today, the Transformational Thought of Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, 1889 to 1943, presented by Rabbi David Maayan, the Maureen and Douglas Cohn Chair and Jewish Thought, and Assistant Director of the CCJS. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our program, and I want to remind everyone who's registered that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program, a time to ask Rabbi Maayan questions about his presentation. So feel free at the bottom of your screen there on the Zoom application, you should have a Q&A button, and you can use that button to submit questions. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but we will try to get to them toward the end of the hour. I want to now go ahead and turn to introducing our speaker, and who is also my colleague and very good friend. Rabbi David Maayan is the Maureen and Douglas Cohn Chair in Jewish Thought and Assistant Director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. Rabbi Maayan received his rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Zalman and Goldberg in Jerusalem in 2004. He is the author of scholarly articles and book chapters on Jewish religious thought, particularly mysticism and Hasidism. He's also the author of book chapters and articles that focus on comparative theology and Jewish-Christian dialogue.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So I'm going to share it right now, the screen. And this is the person that we're here to discuss a little bit tonight. Again, his name is Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman or Kalmish Shapira. He's known as the Rebbe of Piaseczna in Yiddish, Piaseczna, which is a suburb of Warsaw, basically. And tonight, what I really want to talk about is, after going briefly through a little bit of his biography, is to begin to introduce something of the unique vision that comes through in the teachings and the educational approach of Rabbi Shapira that makes him a very unique figure. I would say also a modern figure, which might seem surprising for a Hasidic Rabbi in Poland in the first half of the 20th century, but that's part of a more complex discussion about the relationship between Hasidism and modernity, which this is a part of. So first of all, just a few aspects of his biography to put out. So Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira was born in 1889 in Grodzisk in Poland. At that time, Congress Poland, still under Russian imperial rule. Today, Grodzisk is an industrial center outside of Warsaw, only about 20 minutes by train from Warsaw Central Station. Piaseczna is even closer to Warsaw. It's only about 11 miles from the center of Warsaw. It's really a suburb. And I should mention, even in the Piaseczna Rebbe's lifetime, the train was built. I don't know how good it was or how fast it was compared to today, but the train was built between Piaseczna and Warsaw. And in fact, he moved to Warsaw as a young man. His father was Rabbi Elimelech Shapiro, who was himself a Hasidic Rebbe of Grodzisk, and his mother was Chana Bracha, who was the daughter of a Hasidic Rebbe, the Rebbe of Chenshin. As you can see, if you notice the date, his father lived from 1824 to 1892. That means his father was 65 years old when the Piaseczna Rebbe was born, and in fact, his father passed away when Rabbi Shapira was only 2 years old. In general, though, Rabbi Shapira was descended from some of the most prominent Hasidic masters, especially in Poland, including Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk, the seer of Lublin, and the Koznitzer Maggid, amongst others. As I mentioned, his father died before his third birthday, and he was raised by his mother. And as he grew older, especially by another relative, Rabbi Yerachmiel Moshe Hopstein, who was the Rebbe of Koznitz at that time, whose dates are 1860 to 1909. In fact, this was a particularly important relationship because this same figure later became his father-in-law as he married his daughter, Rachel Chaim Miriam. So Rabbi Shapiro, shortly after his father-in-law died, Rabbi Shapira became the Rebbe of Piaseczna and then also the community rabbi of Piaseczna. He moved to Warsaw, as I mentioned, towards the end of World War One. And one other very important aspect of his life then was that he founded a yeshiva in Warsaw that became one of the biggest Hasidic yeshivas in Warsaw. That was named after his father, and that was named Yeshiva Dat Moshe. He continued to be Rebbe in Piaseczna, and he sometimes traveled back and forth, as I mentioned, to the suburb of Piaseczna for holidays and for other times to be there. Only one book of his was published in his lifetime. It was entitled Chovat HaTalmidim, which translates as The Student's Obligation, and it's directed at relatively young students. There was a sequel to this that was literally at the press when the Nazis invaded Poland, and therefore was not published at that time. We now have 7 primary works by him. Many of the texts of the 7 primary works we have by him were preserved by being buried underneath the Warsaw Ghetto as part of the Einig Shabbos project led by Emanuel Ringelblum. These are some of the famous milk containers and other sort of boxes that the Einig Shabbos materials were preserved. Emanuel Ringelblum was a Jewish historian and politician who started this project in the Warsaw Ghetto to gather materials and write and record materials and gather archive materials to preserve the history of the experience of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and in the Holocaust as it was unfolding. And these were buried and were found after the war, underneath the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. And Rabbi Shapira's writings, as super into them as I am, are one of just a small portion of the many, many, many documents that were preserved, and important things that were preserved by Einig Shabbos. Rabbi Shapira is sometimes called the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, not so much in his lifetime, but afterwards, because he continued to teach and to record his Torah teachings and perform other functions as a Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto. His Holocaust era teachings, in other words, the Divrei Torah, the words of Torah that he taught orally and that he then also wrote down, were published after the war, and the publishers gave it the title Eish Kodesh, which means holy fire. In the manuscript, the teachings are just titled Drashot Mishnot Hazam, Torah teachings from the years of fury, as it were, the years of divine fury. And these teachings are unique, powerful, and deservedly famous. I should mention, I didn't put it on the PowerPoint, but I should mention that Drashot Mishnot Hazam has also been published in a critical edition a few years ago by Professor Daniel Reiser, and that's an extremely, extremely valuable critical edition that was produced. Rabbi Shapira lived the final years of his life in the Warsaw Ghetto before being transferred to the Troniki forced labor and then concentration camp. He was murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators in November of 1943. A lot of scholars have discussed the question of Shapira's faith during the Holocaust, and they've looked to his ghetto teachings for moments of proposed or rejected theodicies, right? If you know, a theodicy is an attempt to explain how a good and all-powerful God, all good and all-powerful God, how can there also then be what appears to be evil in the world, and so on. And that's valid. And, and in fact, scholars have sometimes reached very polarizing conclusions about Shapira's faith during the Holocaust, looking at the writings that way. Even though such studies are very valuable, there's also sometimes a danger that I want to point to of using Rabbi Shapira as kind of a mirror to project one's own concerns or convictions or anxieties related to religion and faith after the Holocaust. To ask whether Rabbi Shapira had faith during the Holocaust, however you answer that question, is often already to assume that faith is a kind of known quantity, which various people either have or do not have, or which may be subject to degrees. It's to make faith a little bit too anonymous or generic. And then that's useful because then I can think about my faith or those of other people that I'm worried about in relation to these kind of questions, and I can, to some extent, project it onto Rabbi Shapira. However, in my opinion, in order to really, there's a fuller appreciation that you can have of his Holocaust writings that comes from first examining his unique vision and his religious project that was articulated throughout his life as a Rebbe and educator before the Holocaust, before the Nazi invasion of Poland. If you look at it in that way, the more that one knows about his project and his vision as it was already articulated before the war, then the question becomes not about some generic faith that then encountered the Holocaust. The question is about what changes Rabbi Shapira's faith in its unique and highly articulated form underwent in the inconceivably pressured environment of the Holocaust and the Warsaw Ghetto. So, in general, and we'll see some texts closely today, some of his texts closely today that we're going to look at to illustrate this. But the general point that I want to emphasize is that Rabbi Shapira's project, one of its unique qualities is that Rabbi Shapira has a kind of unbreakable bedrock value that he places on the idea of each person needing to articulate and sort of become a unique self, to articulate a unique personhood. And this is a constant theme that comes back again and again in his writings, and that we'll see closely inside today. Already that's interesting for one reason, because, and justly so, a lot of people associate Hasidism with conformism, and with kind of authoritarianism that might go together with, with conformism, with a kind of rigid traditionalism that might put an emphasis on continuity of form and less on, innovations or variations that might seem to be required in order for someone to blossom as a unique individual, right? And as I say, some of that is fair enough to a certain extent to characterize a lot of forms of Hasidism as it developed over its history. But in the case of Rabbi Shapira, and I don't think it's completely unique, but in the case of Rabbi Shapira, you have an example of a traditionalist, orthodox, fully observant, certainly Hasidic Rebbe in Poland, who at the same time has this as an extremely strong value that actually in some ways is a kind of telos, is a kind of orientating goal that everything else is in service of, or simply can't be compromised. Well, when you look at it that way, it's not just the question of faith in God, it's the question of Rabbi Shapira's expression of that faith as a lived project, both of seeking self-becoming and self-development as a person, and also as a project guiding others, from the young people in his yeshiva to older people, both through his writings and through personal contacts, of guiding people in this process. And the question is, if fundamentally his project is about an individual becoming differentiated as a unique and full person, and the sort of uncompromising valuation of the personal, what happens when that project encounters the Holocaust, which is not only, for many people, of course, raises questions in general about the existence of God or God's goodness or divine providence and things like that. Of course, it does do that. But here we're interested in Rabbi Shapira's specific project. And of course, ironically, the Holocaust and the Warsaw Ghetto, in many ways, one aspect of what it was for Rabbi Shapira was a uniquely, cruelly designed environment that was designed entirely to crush anyone's sense of individuality and individual dignity and full personhood, right? Reducing people even before they're literally physically exterminated, to already reduce them to a kind of non-existence. In fact, Rabbi Shapira himself uses that exact expression in the Holocaust writings, describing how people become, as it were, as if they're non-people or non-existent through the pressures of the situation. So the question is, what did his project and his vision, how did it change? How was it affected and articulated in a new way by the pressures of that unique, inconceivable environment that he found himself in and his people in? Okay, So I actually am going to do a sneak preview. Tonight, we're mostly going to focus on things that aren't in the Holocaust writings, but I just want to give you one quick example of one of the writings from the Holocaust era, right? From 1940, from the Warsaw Ghetto. And what's on the side is kind of on the right is the text with some of my underlining and stuff. On the left is not really a full translation, but a summary or paraphrase of it. And essentially, what Rabbi Shapira expresses here is the idea that it's impossible to accept consolations for the loss of persons and lives and their intrinsic, unique, and irreplaceable presence. Even if it may be beneficial in some sense for their souls in the supernal world, their souls might be close to God and so on, but still, the way that God created a person was for the fullness of embodied life in this world. And therefore, he says that only the embodied revival, resurrection of the dead can comfort us. Because without the body, without the full embodied personhood in this world, God's purpose for the person is not fulfilled, and the person's own existence, in a serious sense, is incomplete. You can see, if you see here on the side, and I know some people can read Hebrew, of course, and some people maybe cannot, but some of the things that I highlighted and underlined over here, he is just repeated. He repeatedly is using words like isha prati, the particular person, adam yachidi, the unique individual, the unique person, vahaprat vahayachid, about the particular and the unique, specifically, God's presence is mourning and so on. So that this emphasis on the unique individual, here's an example where he's expressing that in terms of mourning and in terms of being unable to be comforted, in terms of a particular form of pain, which he believes is in fact also, as it were, part of the divine, but is also part of his own experience and others' experience during the Holocaust. So even here, you can already see what I mean, that part of the articulation here has to do with this valuing of the unique and particular individual. However, from this source alone, you might think that everybody just sort of is a particular individual, which of course in one sense is true. But as we're going to see, Rabbi Shapira actually has more of an existentialist sense that a person can become a unique individual, and it's upon each one of us to become a unique individual. Okay. So what I want to do right now is look at a couple of specific texts. First, a quite short one. They're both actually from a book that's called Tzav V'Zeruz, which means something like command and arouse or command and inspire. There is an English translation available. It's called To Heal the Soul, although I'm using my own translations and summaries here. And this is one of the pieces from that where it's about twice as long as what you see on the screen. It's a short piece. And here, Rabbi Shapira writes that a person needs to make ladders whereby to rise up towards heaven sometimes from time to time, to inspire yourself to have a kind of ecstatic experience. And a nigun, a melody, is one of those ladders. And particularly if a person sings a melody after the joy of performing a commandment, a mitzvah, and at the same time also perhaps with a broken heart, kind of feeling open heart, that melody that you then sing could be very inspiring. It could be a kind of ladder to reach heavenwards. Okay. And then Rabbi Shapira says something that I think really points to this value of the unique and of the individual in a very visceral way. So this is my translation here. There is a portion from the world of melody which is within each person, every person. Therefore, so each person has their own unique portion of the world of melody. Therefore, it is necessary to awaken the portion that is within you at the time when melodies are sung. For if you do not, and rather you only sing melodies composed by another, this is like water that has been spit out by another, and it is repulsive. So the reason that I wanted to highlight this short text is because, in a way, many of Rabbi Shapira's teachings, how should I put it? They have a very elevated, elegant, kind of very dignified tone to them. And there's also personal descriptions of what he was like as a person, that people sometimes emphasize this quality of carrying himself with a certain kind of dignity and so on. And in a way, this is a very kind of crude metaphor that he uses at the end, right? If you sing someone else's melody, it's like it's like you have their spit in your mouth, and it's gross. Uma'as, right? That's the last word means, and it's repulsive and it's gross. So the reason that I wanted to bring this is for a couple of reasons. One thing is simply the contrast with what would often be thought of, and I'm sure Rabbi Shapira would also agree with this, that Hasidic Rebbes and Hasidic people would usually think, if I'm singing a song and this one goes back 50, 100 years, maybe the song was written by, composed by, or sung by, a Rebbe or some holy people, and so on and so forth. That's all the better. Okay, it's cute. I can try to make my own little melody, but this one, it's so special because it was sung by so many other mouths before me, right? And of course, we know that the Piaseczner Rebbe, learned books by people that came before him and sang songs by people that came before him. But here he says, if you only sing melodies that come from another, right, there's something lacking. You're not connecting to your own portion. There's a kind of uniqueness that is in potential. It's there in the world of melody. Are you connecting to it? Are you singing from that place? Are you bringing that into the world? And he wants to instill, and this is something that he also talks about explicitly, by using this metaphor. He wants to make the point felt and visceral for the reader or for the hearer. So the idea could have been said in a much less aggressive way, and you could convey the idea. But he's not just interested in conveying the idea as some kind of just theoretical or information. He's interested in sharing this kind of visceral sense of, I cannot be satisfied with just drinking someone else's spit. It's a very strong kind of thing that he's trying to put in. And that's part of why I titled this talk about the transformational thought of Rabbi Shapira, because this is an example of something where he's trying to transform or instill something on an emotional level and on a visceral level in the reader and the hearer. And there's a million other examples, but I like this as one example just because you can see that extra step that he's going besides just conveying the idea. This is the longer piece that we're going to look at. And again, I'm going to go through my translations, which are sometimes close translations and sometimes summaries on the left. So in the beginning of this piece, from the same work, from Safra Zerus, in the beginning of this piece, Rabbi Shapira presents a person, and it's sort of a generic person, it's a made-up person, a hypothetical person, how much a person complains. And he says about himself, where is my free will? Right? He knows that in theory, Judaism teach people have free will, but he says, well, I don't feel like I have free will. Where's this free will people say I have? It is as if I am bound in the thick cords of this worldly desires, to the point that it is nearly impossible for me to rule over myself, to choose what to desire and what to reject. So the person feels sort of out of control, and that they don't have a certain kind of, autonomy. They don't have a certain kind of self-rule over their will or over themselves. And so, but they're supposed to have free will, but where is this free will? So the person is complaining. So Rabbi Shapira continues that in truth, however, in order for there to be an autonomous choice, one which finds its origin in the one willing and not in another, it is necessary prior to this that the one choosing must exist unto himself, that he or she should be a particular differentiated person unto themselves. So if there is such a person who is differentiated, nivdal, muvdal la'atzmo, separated unto himself, only if that person first has this differentiated particular existence, some of the same words that we saw in the Holocaust writing, then such a person could then choose or desire for himself in accordance with his own will. And if there is no particular differentiated person unto themselves, but instead only a type, a min can also mean species. So it's sort of like, the person is only an example, as it were, of a type or of a species, then, they're one of the crowd, then neither choice nor an individual will can apply. For those who, for who will choose, he asks, if apart from the fixed ways of the collective, there's nothing here at all. For Rabbi Shapira, the one who complains about his lack of free will, as fundamental as an element of a human being that is, in fact lacks something even more fundamental than free will. They lack existence. Obviously, I don't mean they lack existence as a biological entity or that they're literally not a human being or anything like that, but they lack existence as a differentiated individual. That is not something that's a given, but it's something that a person needs to work towards. And in a sense, part of what Rabbi Shapira's analysis at the very beginning here is that the person complaining about where's my free will, their analysis hasn't gone deep enough. They haven't really doubted that they exist in this sense. They don't really know what they're missing. And so he's trying to point to an even more fundamental lack within the person. This lack of existence is marked powerfully in this text by Rabbi Shapira's use of the phrase ein kan me'uma. There's nothing other than the sort of rules of the collective or herd mentality. Star translates it. Other than that, there is nothing here at all. Ein kan me'uma. Ein kan me'uma. There's nothing here at all. So part of the question is, but where is here? What is Rabbi Shapira pointing to when he says there's nothing here at all? So he continues, and he says that Vistakel na b'nafshecha, please gaze within yourself and ask, have you brought forth et amitut atzmecha, the truth of yourself, or your true self, you could translate it. This is what the here was that he was referring to. The here is that interior space, which is accessed through introspection. There's nothing here. But he's then asking the person, please, vistakel na, please look within yourself and see what's there. Again, part of his analysis is that a lot of us, and he writes about this in many other places, we get distracted, we're focused on other things, etc. We don't know how to introspect, we don't have time, we don't make time for it, etc. And so we don't look within to find both what's lacking and then also a space where something can grow and be developed. Another scholar, Tomer Persico, who wrote a great book on Jewish meditative tradition in Hebrew, he writes a lot about Rabbi Shapira in that book, and he emphasizes this need for introspection is a constant emphasis throughout Rabbi Shapira's works, which is correct. And also, he points out that it's associated with the birth or revelation of the self, which is exactly what's happening in this text as well. So as I already mentioned, and for sure, the word existentialist, along with a lot of other words, is a word that's been used and abused and used very loosely. But I still think personally it's helpful to say that Rabbi Shapira, in an important sense, is a religious existentialist. What I mean by that here is that rather than something assumed or simply given, one's existence, in the sense we're speaking about it here, is something that's brought forth through a conscious effort and requires a struggle as well. Elsewhere, he compares it to swimming upstream, partly, again, this idea of going against the current of what might be the collective or conformist views. One articulates a unique self through both introspective consciousness, as he's constantly wanting people to do more introspection, but also through actions, including performing mitzvot and religious actions, which articulate one's unique self. So again, he asks the person to look within themselves and says, the reader, and says, have you brought forth the truth of yourself? These are the questions he asks then. Are you a differentiated person unto yourself? Or are you merely a portion of the collective, a kind of member of the human species? Are you like a plant or an animal? A plant or an animal, for all of their individual existence, in a sense, they have individual existence, of course. But also they're also merely a portion of the collective. In other words, the individual of an animal or a plant is defined entirely by the shared characteristics of the species. a person cannot differentiate himself from the collective just by quantities. For example, the amount of his intellect or of his will, which may indeed differ from that of another person. That's true. But that's not what makes for a true human individuality. Because after all, individual animals also have such variations, right? There's the fastest animal in the pack, or the strongest, and so on. The fastest wolf in the pack is not truly a differentiated individual in the sense of a human person, although obviously you can distinguish it from the other wolves. It's not the fullness of what a person can be when they're differentiated. Rather, a person is differentiated with the character of his unique quality, not the difference of quantity, but an actual quality of their personhood, which is unique unto himself, I should say unto. This means more than simply that the opinions and behaviors of society do not sort of bind him or encage him, limiting his vision so that he cannot see beyond them. Like, of course, he would demand that. You don't have this existence if you're just totally defined by, the pressures of popular opinion, whatever society or sub-society you may be defined by. No, if you're completely defined by that, he says, then you're not a Jew. You're not even a person. That's different from becoming a fully differentiated individual. That's sort of part of truly being a full person in even a more basic sense. Rather, the person has to actually reveal from within himself a personal self or a personal essence and an image which is unique unto itself. Gam atzmit ishiyut udiokan miyuchad la'atzmo yigala mikirbo. A personal self or essence and an image which is unique unto itself. The word diokan, as I have noted on the bottom there, is an Aramaic word, which is a Greek. It's really from the Greek. It's found not infrequently in rabbinic literature. It also plays an important role in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, which is definitely influencing Rabbi Shapira's use of it here. But it's from the same Greek root as the English word icon. So it really does mean an image, and it's often used to mark the unique image of the unique form, frequently of a person, although not only. In this context, of course, it's a person. So the person needs to create and sort of carve out and articulate this unique image or icon of themselves. Okay, so I want to sort of pull back for a second and say one broad question that comes up when looking at Rabbi Shapira is, can Hasidism or Orthodox Judaism more broadly, perhaps we can broaden it from that too, how can a religion that has a religious practice that has halakha, that has, the practice of halakha, of Jewish law, how can it be individualist without being antinomian, right? Antinomian, of course, meaning like anti-law, right? One way you could express your individuality is by sometimes, not doing a mitzvah, or doing it differently, or doing it in a way that technically they say that you're not supposed to do it that way, but this is how I'm so unique, right? In other words, doesn't halakha define how mitzvot are to be performed? And therefore, doesn't it implicitly demand conformity? Of course, one answer to this question, by the way, is you could say, well, not everything, and actually that's very, very true. Not everything in the life, even of a, fully observant or whatever Jew, is defined by halakha. There are lots of things, including extremely important decisions that people make, that are not, determined one way or the other or dictated by halakha. And so maybe your individuality can blossom there. But actually, Rabbi Shapira's approach is going to be that even in the very act of studying Torah and doing mitzvot, you can develop and articulate your individual self, and in fact, it's upon us, each one of us, to do that. So within Rabbi Shapira, and I'm not saying he raises this question of antinomianism. I don't know if it would have occurred to him in this form. I don't think he saw it as really attention, but I'm just pointing out as a question how I think one answer that would come from his writing here is that by distinguishing between that which is measurable and objective quantities, and then that which is a unique and personal quality, Rabbi Shapira avoids antinomianism, even while demanding that the individual differentiate himself from the collective. Basically, the what of a mitzvah, what time do you have to do this mitzvah, which day, what materials are required and what quantities. There are all kinds of things like that about, how big and how long and when and so on to fulfill a mitzvah that are brought in Jewish tradition. Those things may be defined by halakha, but all of that is the what. All of that is the quantities. But this is distinct from the question of the unique how of the act, which can and in truth should be an act of self-revelation and self-expression. So I think we can look at what Rabbi Shapira is saying here in a much broader sense about how he's understanding and formulating his understanding of Torah in relation to this question of individuality and halakha. So here's where he articulates this. He says there should be something unique in the person's Torah and devotional service, not merely in terms of quantity, such that one might show that he shows a lot of intellect, for example, right? In their Torah teaching, you could say they're very intelligent or something, as if it's just a matter of IQ score or something, it's quantifiable. But there should also be revealed the attribute of the person's unique quality, such that someone would say, derech zeh lo b'Torah v'zeh b'avoda. This is this person's way in Torah. This is this person's way in their devotional service. When a person encounters his original Torah insights or the manner of his devotional service, he writes, everyone will recognize that they belong to this Torah scholar, this devotee, because they have a unique form and image. Yeah. That, by the way, that language of recognize, lahakir in Hebrew, is important because throughout his writings, Rabbi Shapira often uses the word recognize for the idea of, again, like recognizing a person, recognizing a presence, and sometimes distinguishing that from knowing about, which of course you can also know about a person, and knowing that would be a little bit more objective, but recognizing is, seeing who someone is. So again, the goal here is that everyone will recognize when they see this person's Torah, their teaching, or their learning, or their acts, that they must belong to this Torah scholar, this devotee, because they have a unique form and image. He gives the example of the Rambam and the Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides, where he says, you can recognize the unique way of each one of them. If you had a paragraph of the Rambam and a paragraph of the Ramban, and you know a little bit about enough about them, even if you don't know the specific paragraph, you could very quickly recognize whose pen it came from. Why is that? So he writes, because each one revealed his self, his image, unique unto his personhood, which is differentiated from any other by means of the Torah and the wisdom that they taught. And that's my translation directly from. He has a lot of repeated emphasis on these words: self, image, unique unto himself, differentiated from any other. And he reveals that by means of his Torah and his wisdom. I want to spotlight one more question here as we have a couple more minutes, which is the question of instrumentalization, the instrumentalization of religion. As he writes here, each one, using the examples of Maimonides and Nachmanides, revealed his self by means of the Torah and the wisdom that they wrote about. So the phrasing here that they revealed themselves articulated themselves by means of the Torah raises the question of the instrumentalization of religion. In other words, it makes both Torah study and the performance of mitzvot means to the end of self-expression, or perhaps stronger and better, self-revelation, self-articulation, right? So their means, by means of the Torah and the wisdom, he revealed himself. This question about instrumentalization has been raised by scholars in relation to much earlier Jewish thinkers, including actually Maimonides himself. But the way in which Rabbi Shapira articulates the goal here is one of many things that reveal him as a modern thinker, even though as a traditionalist. I'm not raising this point as a criticism of Rabbi Shapira, but just to point to this aspect that puts him a little bit in this discussion of sort of modern approaches to religion and spirituality, where a person is figuring how can I draw on the tradition and how can I make use of these in this project of self-becoming, self-discovery, self-articulation. Yeah. I think there are ways in which that way of thinking can become very criticizable But I'm not saying that that happens in Rabbi Shapira, but I'm just pointing that he's entering into that modern realm where those kind of questions can come up. Okay, so just a little bit more here. Even though he brought the examples of Maimonides and Nachmanides, who are obviously towering figures, he then says, but it's not only such figures that do that or have to do that or should do that, articulate this unique self. In fact, it's upon each individual to reveal that form and image that's unique to the person. In accordance with that personhood, that self that is unique unto him that a person reveals, within that, his free and autonomous will may be found. This is sort of wrapping up to the beginning that the person, where's my free will? Well, the answer is first you have to articulate this personhood, this unique self, and then you can find that will. And the final sentence of this piece is raise yourself up from the world and reveal your personhood from, in other words, differentiated from the human collective, and you will become a person who can choose and who can serve God. So in conclusion, this is part one of, hopefully there'll also be a second session we have scheduled for November 14th, I believe it is, a Thursday, also at noon to 1. I'm going to go look a little bit further and look at different works to discuss both Rabbi Shapira's vision and some of his techniques that he also wanted to convey about how to engage in this kind of work. And then the plan is for in the spring to offer 1 or 2 sessions that will look more, and then we will look more directly at the Holocaust writings with this sort of background already in mind, to look at what becomes of his thought and his vision and how it's articulated in that unique and incomprehensible circumstance. So again, like a passage like this that we started with can take on added resonance in the light of that. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and we have a little bit of time if there's questions and answers. But thank you for joining me.
Rabbi Maayan, thank you very much for your presentation. Several questions come to mind. We have a few here. One is, what are some principles from Rabbi Shapira's thought that are directly relevant for interreligious dialogue? How might Rabbi Shapira's thinking particularly help us with Catholic-Jewish relations? Just 2 broad questions there.
I mean, that's a great question. I think, I didn't have time to articulate those as part of the presentation today, but that's a great question. I definitely think, even though I didn't name it explicitly in this little presentation, I definitely think that the question about halakha and about law and how that relates to a person, the uniqueness of a person's unique expression, that's one of the ways in which the personal, sometimes in anti-Jewish polemics, sometimes there can be a presentation where, right, famously, where Christianity is a religion of love and of a personal relationship, perhaps with God, perhaps made possible in a unique way because of Jesus and through Jesus. And then Judaism is sometimes polemically presented as, this religion of law and rules and conformity. We know that sometimes Jesus in the Gospels is sort of iconoclastic, or he's breaking those rules a little bit or playing with them a little bit. Well, that's a big discussion, but you understand what I'm saying. So I think that is one aspect, is that instead of just polemically shooting back, no, that's not true, here is an example of looking at a particular thinker and seeing, a particular way that the kind of tension and those kind of elements are, how do they live together and how do they work in his thought in particular? And you can continue that with lots of other examples, but I think that's one thing that comes to mind that's important. I think a second thing I would say is a little bit of a broader point, which is that in general, my belief is that while it's important and valuable to compare, I guess, what we would call doctrines and beliefs and ideas between religions and between Judaism and Christianity, sometimes one of the very useful ways to compare is to also ask, not just what is articulated as a truth or what do you believe or what is taught, but what function does that serve, right? What does this help as a means towards what? So, example that I sometimes give is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in the section on incarnation, there's a kind of preliminary section, which is like, why the incarnation? And it gives, I think, 5 different sort of traditional answers or ideas, that some of which are all compatible, but it gives a bunch of different ideas from a Catholic point of view of why the incarnation was necessary, or how the incarnation, benefits us. And so even though once it gets to describing what the actual belief of the incarnation is, you'll find things that are completely incompatible with the vast majority of forms of Jewish theology. That's also an interesting discussion too, but in general. But when you look at the things it says about why, for example, it says so that God could be a kind of model for us to imitate, so that we could go in his ways. So through the incarnation, you have God as a human who therefore can be a model and that we follow in his ways. Well, immediately when I read that, from a Jewish perspective, I think immediately about the mitzvah of v'halachta b'drachav, walk in his ways, which is in the Torah, and the way that the rabbis actually understood that by saying, well, what does God do? He visits the sick, he clothes the naked, he helps they give examples that are really sort of human activities, but that in the midrash, in the rabbinic imagination, these activities have already been articulated, and sort of there's an imaginative model of God as doing those things, so that I can then imitate them. So that's just one example. And the reason I'm connecting with Rabbi Shapira is because the way that is discussing very explicitly how a person can approach religion and as a model of self, as a means of self-transformation and self-becoming. And then we look at how he's articulating these techniques and these approaches to that, and what kind of person the person is seeking to become, and how different religious tools can help in that. That already opens up a different lens from which to look at the comparative question, and you can find things that resonate with each other, while of course not being the same. Might be able to find things that can resonate with each other in an interesting way that would be obscured by just asking the questions, about how certain beliefs or doctrines differ, which is a more obvious but important point. I hope that was clear enough the way I articulated it.
Thank you, Rabbi Maayan. Yes, it is. And it actually makes me think quite a bit about development, the idea of human flourishing and development, at least, from the Catholic tradition. I can see some possible resonance there with, interest in developing qualities being central to life, and not merely the expression of one's will, but the expression of one's will with regard to seeing the rules as a form of flourishing. As a quality that's built up in you. Another question is, you mentioned individuation, or personal individuation, and yet so much today is impersonal relationships online and social media. Are there ways in which Rabbi Shapira's thinking might assist us with how to engage this in technology and social media that can sometimes dehumanize or make things impersonalize people?
Yeah, I do think so. I think in general that one of the most important things is that Rabbi Shapira, sort of demands this act of introspection, including something that's quite scary, which is looking within and finding a kind of lack or an emptiness. Ein kan me'uma, there's nothing here. For Rabbi Shapiro, that kind of moment of facing or recognizing that there is a kind of hollowness within oneself, within one's life, is itself a necessary step in order to then open up to these things that are and sound much more pleasant, flourishing and growth and development and becoming and so on. And he also speaks about deepening and expanding one's emotional awareness, expanding one's ability for empathy. So even though it starts with this emphasis on introspection in terms of self-developing, it's not about retreating into oneself, but rather it's about being able to grow from within oneself towards a much deeper and much more feeling connection with the world. So I do think that for a lot of people, and again, you articulated some particular challenges of recent times in our generation or whatever, But I think that for a lot of people, there really is this step of not of avoiding unconsciously, avoiding looking within in the first place. And if you don't have a sense of something lacking, then this process can't start. So I think that's a really important element that's there, and that's why I think this attempt to articulate a kind of visceral sense of the person lacking or being in a kind of um, he's trying to arouse the person, not just, hey, you could also do this, but to feel a kind of move away from where the person is at. And there's a recognition that there's a kind of numb comfort that can come from not beginning this work. And so there's this push towards the person to look within and face that experience of recognizing a kind of lack or a kind of emptiness as the beginning of a process.
Thank you, David. Finally, what drew you to Rabbi Shapira? There are many figures that one can focus on. I know this is a bit more of a personal question. Sometimes scholars
Yeah,
don't want to answer a personal question, but it just struck me as perhaps an important one, a
sure.
nice one, maybe a fitting one to close on.
Let's see. When I remember in the a year or two before I moved to Eretz Israel, before I moved to Israel, I studied in Israel for 6 years. And in the couple of years before that, I had a couple of very good teachers and rabbis who pointed me to the Piasetzner Rebbe, and that I started studying. Originally, there were a couple of English translations that were already available of a couple of works, and I looked at those. And then later, as my abilities grew, I started to study them in the original language. And when I was in yeshiva, I got in my young 20s, I got very, very interested in all of Rabbi Shapira's writings. Again, I think on the one hand, there was the Holocaust stuff that was just such incredibly profound reflections on suffering, on notions of divine suffering. It was written with such empathy and such a sense of feeling and heart, and at the same time, this incredible, to me, part of the incredible faith in that work is simply that it's they're Torah teachings that then they start off saying this is what it says in the Torah portion of the week, and here's the Rashi at the beginning of the Torah portion, the Rashi's commentary, and then saying what does this mean for us in our situation? Amatzavenu, that's what he always says. What does this mean for us in our situation? The answers and the responses that he gives are generally incredible, but the question is incredible. The question is saying not just that I can continue to learn Torah and study the Torah portion of the week and say something about it in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's not just, that's already an amazing thing for a person to do, and many people did it. He's not just saying that, though. He's saying, I want to learn the Torah of this place. I want to look at the Torah portion of the week and the Rashi that's been, here for hundreds and hundreds of years. But now I want to look at it and say, what does it mean for us now in the Warsaw Ghetto? And he has that faith that looking at the Torah every week and looking at Rashi every week is going to reveal something that's relevant and meaningful for his situation where he finds it. And then the one other thing that I would say is I think that from all of his writings, I think that I was deeply attracted to this aspect of this project of the articulation of a unique self. But at the same time, I wasn't able to articulate it in that way at the time. It was something that spoke so deeply to me almost that I couldn't be so self-conscious about it. I was like, yes, I don't know. I connected to it so much. So now, being older and doing some, academic work in Jewish studies and in comparative theology, things start to turn in a different way until you try to seek to articulate that more externally and articulate it in a way that you communicate it to others. But I do think that spoke very deeply to me, and I think it's spoken deeply to a lot of people. He is, thank God, well known, very well known, and very respected. At the same time, I would wish for his Holocaust writings, which are awesome and should always be studied. I would wish for them to be seen also in the light of all of his writings. And again, there are many other people that look at all of that, but there are also some that do not. And I think that there's even so much more there the more that you look at all of his thought. So, thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you very much for this incredibly enlightening presentation that introduces us to a profound thinker and figure with relevance for dialogue and with relevance for interreligious relations. Truly a profound person from one of the most difficult times in history. And so we're really thankful for your time today. For those of you who have tuned in, please remember, as Rabbi Maayan said, November 14th is the next day in which we will host the online program focused on Shapira's thinking. That will be Thursday, November 14th, 12 p.m. To 1 p.m. We want to thank all of you who have attended today, and thank you for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.